you, Adam. Great.
All right, I think we're going to get started. Welcome, everybody. This is our final Learning Sciences Talk Series event of the semester. It is my distinct pleasure to welcome Dr. Lauren Vogelstein to our wonderful space here. Lauren is not only a cherished colleague, but a friend. And she has a wonderful history. She's a recent alum of the Learning Sciences program in Vanderbilt University. She got her master's in learning sciences at Northwestern, but then before that, she did a BFA in dance. And one of the wonderful things you'll see about her work is how she manages to weave together all the threads of dance and embodiment, of learning mathematics and science, and also sort of, I'll just say, becoming. All of those are things that I think her work really highlights for all of us. She's currently a visiting assistant professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, where she teaches in the dance education program. And with that, I would like to, A, invite anyone who needs food to go get it, and B, join me in welcoming Dr. Vogelstein.
Hello, everybody. I see some familiar faces in the audience and some new faces and some, familiar and new. I'm so happy to be here. Chris has been like one of the best mentors ever. It's been such a, I feel so lucky to have crossed paths with Chris and to finally, like, we've been talking about this for years. He's like, you need to come to Buffalo. It's awesome. And then I did in June. And then he was like, okay, come again. So I hope that you enjoy this talk. I hope it's good. I hope we can have a fun conversation afterwards. I'm going to share a little bit about myself and what I love and what I care about, and I hope you find it interesting and generative for what you love and you care about as well. So we're going to talk today about moving through uncertainty, which is this idea I've been thinking about for a little bit in terms of ensemble choreographic resources for sense making and learning. So I'm going to start with a moment. I'm learning that I am an empiricist at heart, and if I can't see it in data and interaction, I don't really care much about it. So we're going to start with a moment, an utterance from a youth participant. This was in the end of a 2 week. The first week was the end of the first week of 2 of a camp where we brought middle schoolers, scientists, and choreographers together to think about scientist problems using choreography as a form of modeling and agent-based modeling together. We'll just focus on the choreography part today. But we had just done this activity that our choreographer collaborators called liquid architecture, where the groups had created choreography in response to these 6 images. There's only 5 up there, but in response to these 6 images, and we were having a group reflection about what just happened. And one of the students said, I liked how the atomic sharks, which was what his group called themselves, had so much fun coming up with ways to describe the pictures, even though we didn't really know what they were. And so what I think is interesting is that he says a few things. He says, we had a lot of fun. We described things, but we didn't really know what they were. And so the we didn't really know kind of troubled me and made me think about, well, what was this experience? So we did things, although we didn't know. And so to me, that was sort of an interesting contradiction in his utterance. And so if we think about science learning or all learning, uncertainty is a big part of learning. Feeling puzzled, feeling excited, feeling like what kind of feelings do we orient towards in inquiry? We can look at John Dewey's work. We can look at Theo Kiefert and colleagues' work about inquiry from sort of a member's perspective, that is sort of a first part to scientific or other forms of inquiry is like feeling puzzled or not knowing. So that's great. But if we look at other work in science education, it can also sort of foreground that uncertainty can be scary, that there are that how we sort of attune to our feelings, scientists do that as well. We're not the only ones. Jabber and Hammer's piece is like so great in thinking about emotional attunement in science learning, but it can be scary. And in a lot of STEM learning environments in particular, uncertainty or not knowing often serves as a rationale to exclude people from participation, right? It's a way that people can quickly demonstrate incompetence by saying things like, I don't know, or I'm not sure. that's like, oh, you don't belong here. You don't have a stake here. You have to know to be here. You have to be certain. And that can serve as a gatekeeper and block participation. So this, I think, is a really interesting instance in which unknowing did not stop participation, but actually generated interesting collaborative inquiry. And so if we think about sort of these narrowed views of sense making in lots of STEM and science learning environments in particular, they often discount embodied ways of knowing. And so what happens if uncertainty can be generative through leveraging the body, we might be able to sort of expand what counts as knowing in these spaces. And so that's what really drew me to this moment of like, we didn't know and yet we still did things. So I think that means they did know things if they were still able to continue and participate. So what counts as knowing? We might need to broaden what counts as knowing. And so I wanted to start by showing you what was it that they made. They described these pictures. They came up with some choreography. They shared it to the group. So I'm just going to give you a little taste of what that looked like, what their sort of final share out or presentation looked like. So this is the Atomic Sharks.
Okay, our group is ready. Now we will be presenting Atomic Sharks.
Atomic Sharks. Atomic Sharks. Title of the song.
And I've augmented this video with the
Everybody
images
good?
that they were responding to. So for someone who said we didn't know what these images were, I think they knew quite a lot, or they were able to think about a lot of things in response to that. So in thinking about ensemble choreographic resources for sense-making learning, as a case of moving through uncertainty, we can sort of look at this as sort of spurring us to think about these. And I think what's really beautiful about this case is that embodied ways of knowing were foregrounded. Not knowing did not prevent participation. In fact, it sort of spurred generativity and collective thinking, and it was fun. He says it was fun. They had fun. They really enjoyed. You can see smiles. You can see sort of forms of positive affect. And so to me, it begs the question of like, well, what's going on? How does this happen? And so the two sort of main questions that really guide a lot of my work, but this talk in particular, is the first is like, well, how do people move through uncertainty together? If they're able to do it, we sort of have evidence that they can. How do they do it? And so we're going to look at an ethnographic case of professional dancers to sort of discipline our perceptions to sort of see what is this practice that does this? And then how can we leverage these practices, which I think we've done in this camp, to disrupt narrow ways of doing STEM? And so we'll look at the case of the Atomic Sharks building their third choreographic tableau. And when I think about bringing these questions together, what I think about is conceptually ensemble embodied learning. Sometimes I care about the STEM, sometimes I don't. Today we'll care about the STEM. And I think about this in terms of improvisational dance practices that sort of have two components to them. They start with what individuals know and feel in their own bodies. So the sort of phenomenological sensations of what one can feel and sense is important, but it doesn't end with the individual body. We can explore what a group of people can express and know together. So what can individuals' bodies feel on their own, and then what can they express and explore when in conversation with other moving bodies? And so I think this first one is really grounded for me in postmodern theories of dance. When I say improvisational dance practices, there are specific genres that I draw on, and embodied theories of learning in general. And then I don't know why that's not aligned properly, but whatever. And then the second one I think really comes from a foundation of sociocultural theories of learning, and this notion in particular of ensemble learning. And so in terms of postmodern dance theories, I draw from the postmodern dance movement that came out of the downtown New York City dance scene in about the 60s and 70s with people like Trisha Brown, and Liz Lerman wasn't in New York at the time. She was in DC, but they sort of come together. And what was really revolutionary at the time, what was happening in the world of dance, was there were choreographers saying that any body, not just a thin, waif, classically trained, sort of balletic, Eurocentric body, can dance. And any movement can dance. Like walking can be a dance. We could make a whole dance out of people walking. Like that was really revolutionary at the time, that any movement and any body can dance. And that choreography can develop from dancers' responses to prompts instead of a predetermined set of movements determined from a choreographer's body. So you see like Merce Cunningham was playing a lot with chance dance, like what happens when when it's not the same every time and things emerge through chance operations. And so these ideas of choreographic scores or developing rules or prompts for dancers to respond to, like really sparked from this postmodern dance movement. And so that is sort of the dance tradition that I draw a lineage to myself, although I am classically trained, which is a mix of feelings. And then embodied theories of learning. So I came to graduate school, I came to the field of the learning sciences from this dance perspective. And then I was sort of told how other people thought about embodiment through learning. And some I liked and some I were like, no. But I have a mixed relationship with Lakoff and Nunez. I've never met them, but I've read them a lot. And one of the things I like from them is that they foreground that human cognition is grounded in sensory motor experiences, so that everything we know and understand is grounded in how we move and interact with the world. I like that. I don't like everything they say, but I do like that. I also like this idea that embodied actions are insights and understandings in their own right, drawing from Reed Stevens' commentary on a JLS special issue on embodied mathematics, that we are not thinking about the body. There are some embodied cognition theorists who think about the body as in service of the mind, that we can move and then sort of incept our brains to understand something, and we're moving towards sort of a higher cognitive brain-based thing where we don't need the bodies anymore. That's not what I'm about. I think that the body is always sort of present and can be used in thinking processes, that it's valuable in its own right, that we can think about learning as enacted through physical movements and interactions. So how is it that learning is happening through physical interactions in spaces with people, tools, environments? We can think about that embodied actions are environmentally coupled and recipient designed, really drawing on Chuck Goodwin's work, that, if I point or I do something that doesn't exist acontextual or decontextualized, if I'm pointing to something, it's in reference to that. It shares meaning based on what's in the context and what my body is doing. It's also recipient designed. I'm doing this for an audience or for someone else to see, which sort of allows us to draw on methods of video analysis, because what's made relevant to people in an interaction can be recorded and sort of sleuthed about later on in analysis. And that embodied interactions provide the material for future interactions. I'll talk a little bit more about Chuck Goodwin's notion of substrate that I really love and think is beautiful, but that our prior interactions come from our current interactions come from remixing prior interactions and sort of the interactional soup that's around us. And so what we do in the moment also provides fodder for future interactions. And then when thinking about moving sort of from the individual to the social or the group and what groups could do together, I really love Chris Gutierrez, Barbara Rogoff, and Jean Lave's work in general, but thinking about learning as being observed through shifts in participation. One of the things I'm currently struggling with is, even though that was so revolutionary at the time when Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger wrote that, I find that most evidence of shifts in participation are still verbal utterances that sort of evidence how one person was doing something one way and now they're talking about doing something in another way, or what they're saying while they do it shifts. And so I'm really trying to think about, well, can we have non-verbal or purely physical examples of shifts in participation, and what is that evidence of? Sort of a question I have for the field, and I think it's a complicated one. That learning is always happening. It's not just happening in spaces that are intentionally designed for learning. We're going to look at sort of intentionally designed spaces, a professional dance studio and this camp. But not all learning is the result of that means not all learning is the result of direct instruction. So we're not only looking for how people respond to sort of the most powerful person in the room. It's sort of also where we can look for where learning happens, and that it's relational. It happens with and amongst people, and that relationships and new possibilities can develop in that way. And then lastly, I love this notion that Jasmine Ma and Rogers Hall have written about of ensemble learning, that there are some things that must be learned together, which is really distinct from the way schools are designed, where the target activity or the tested activity is what individuals can do. But is there a phenomenon where the target activity cannot be done alone? So they studied a high school marching band. You can't learn how to be a high school marching band on your own. You have to practice together. You can't understand what a group of dancers can create choreographically as a group on their own. They have to be there together. So what kinds of things must be learned together and are cannot be separated individually? So that's why ensemble, I think ensemble's in the title. So when we think about how do people move through uncertainty in these postmodern dance, embodied and sociocultural ways, and then how can we leverage those to disrupt doing STEM? This insight I gained from working with Chris on the PLCS project is drawing on Chris Gutierrez's notion of syncretic learning, that I think is a design framework. I don't know if she agrees with me, but I think it's a design framework where she thinks about taking everyday knowledge practices and scientific knowledge practices. Instead of the everyday, I think about artistic practices, and we can talk about that later. But bringing knowledge practices that are generally thought of hierarchically, with the science as being better or on top, and what happens when you sort of crash them together and new knowledge practices can emerge. And she writes that can, doesn't always, but it can allow for the reorganization of everyday and scientific knowledge, and that can transform the practice. So it can transform the structure of whose ideas are valuable. It can transform how ideas are co-constructed. And so I think a lot about how to bring artistic practices and scientific practices together to decenter the hierarchy of science over art. And that's sort of how we go from how do people do what they do to how can we leverage that to disrupt doing sort of normative or exclusionary versions of STEM. And so methodologically, that means drawing a lot on ethnography and methods of design-based research and participatory design-based research, and then looking interactionally in both of those spaces to bring them together. And so a lot of the cycle of this work starts with ethnography. We'll start with this case of physical research, of documenting existing disciplinary practices. What are those practices? How do dancers explore or move through uncertainty together? What does that look like? Doing some close interactional work to understand the how of that. So the interaction analysis allows for sort of a mechanistic understanding of how do these disciplinary practices operate, not just what are they. I do a lot of work studying artists in order to do that, to leverage and showcase the brilliance of artists. But then it's also the syncretic thing. So what are these scientists doing? And so I have not personally studied scientists, but I do draw on work from Eleanor Oakes and Natasha Myers that document existing embodied practices in scientists' practices. And when we bring those together, how can we bring those embodied practices together to think about designing for youth, or in this case, intergenerational learning between youth and scientists? And so we can now get at this dance science physical research type thing. So how can we look at connections across disciplines? And then how can we look interactionally at what's happening to look at what ways are participation structures being reorganized? Are they being reorganized, and in what way? And so that gets at sort of the how these transdisciplinary or syncretic practices might emerge. And this is always done for me in collaboration with artists. So you'll see leveraging and showcasing the brilliance of artists is a through line throughout this work. I don't think you can do this work without artists. And so empirically, I'm going to take you through two cases. We're going to go into the dance studio to look at physical research as an artistic inquiry practice. And then we're going to track and see, I think I make a compelling case that we can see seeds of this practice emerging in this intergenerational group of middle schoolers, scientists, and choreographers in this dance science physical research activity with our esteemed atomic sharks. So we're going to start in the dance studio, physical research, as a case of ethnographically grounded ensemble embodied learning. So this first question, how do people move through uncertainty together, is sort of more of an ethnographic question. One answer is physical research. It's a practice professional dancers use to move through uncertainty together. This is an EMIC term, this dance company. They use this own term to describe their practice. It's not a term that I use to describe what they did. I'm going to just show you a little bit. You'll see these two images are of the same thing. It's not the exact same moment, but as part of, I like to say I come from the Rogers Hall School of Cameras Everywhere. He was my doctoral advisor, and so I always record from multiple angles. And so this is sort of a side angle of the studio, and that is a front angle of the studio from the choreographer's perspective. And so we're going to look at how this choreography emerged.
So how can some of us create warm water with our bodies and some of us create red wine? Yeah, and you're welcome to like talk to each other and can my people who are warm water, the people that are lying down and Emma, make this on a diagonal with Emma being the most upstage right and Hadassah being the most downstage left?
And so before we started with a group of people just standing there, and we end with this really complicated structure that they've created. And so this piece of video comes from 2 seasons of ethnographic fieldwork. This company sort of worked, a season was sort of similar to a school year from fall to spring. I followed them for 2 seasons, so 14 months over 2 years total. I was there in the studio 1 to 2 times a week. They rehearsed Monday through Friday for 3 hours. When I was there for the full 3 hours. I video recorded from multiple angles. I took field notes documenting what was said, the organizational structure of activities, and I also conducted video elicited interviews with the artistic director and some of the company members. As I was starting to identify this practice, I would share some of these clips of like, well, what do you see that's going on here? Are my ethnographic findings sort of matching your perspective? And if not, why? You can see that here are the dancers. There is the choreographer who actually, in this case, she was a dancer in the company who had a choreographic residency, so her relationship to the dancers was complicated. And there's me scribbling my jottings in the field note sitting next to the choreographer. I like to say that what allowed me into the space is that I had a background in dance that Chris talked about. When I met with the artistic director to talk about studying this group, that I had a BFA from Alvin Ailey was comforting to her because it meant that I understood how to operate in this space. It meant I knew when it was appropriate to run up to another dancer and jump on them. It meant that I could do that. It meant I knew that I would sort of stay on the periphery of the space. It meant I knew to take my shoes off in the space and not walk on their marley floor. It meant it's a very vulnerable thing to watch someone making art and creating. And so I had sort of a foot in the door that way. So that was great and wonderful, but it also prevented challenges because in interviewing or talking with dancers, I had to sometimes play dumb in ways that felt like I was betraying their trust because I needed things from their perspective and not mine. And so things that might be taken for granted or shared, I had to be like, no, I don't know what you're saying. What do you mean? And a lot of times it was generative because our ideas weren't exactly aligned, but that was a tricky thing to navigate as someone who had sort of an insider status, but also was an outsider. And you can see that here in thinking about sort of why even are these dancers engaging in this practice. Curtis, one of the dancers, shared during our interview a few things, and I'll share this clip of Curtis.
I feel like our relationship to the choreographer is like we're partners, you know, and we're like we are like the physicalization of like the ideas that she's trying to get across, you know, and it's different than I think what the standard is because is like openly and knowingly being unknowing in the room, you know?
Yeah. So he says a few things. One is he talks about this partnership, that there's a partnership between the dancers and choreographers. There's some sense of we are in this together. The other thing he notices is that the choreographer comes from a stance of unknowing or not knowing. So this idea of moving through uncertainty, they are starting from a stance of we are uncertain, we don't know what's possible, which is, he says, is very different from other sort of forms of choreographic activity where a choreographer comes in and says, I got the 8 count, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay, you got it. Let's do it. Like, that's very different than saying, I don't know what's possible. I have ideas. And that sort of unknowing to him really necessitates the group, that we have to do this together. It makes this sort of an ensemble activity. We can't do this apart. We have different roles, but we need to sort of work together. And so this idea of you need this like beautiful, brilliant group of people to do this. And so that to him draws him to this practice. And other dancers shared very similar reasons for why they were drawn to engaging in this practice. And so there's something here then about like moving through uncertainty together was attractive to this group of people. It was something they wanted to do, and it sort of felt, I think dignity affirming is too strong a stance, because I don't think they always felt like their dignity was affirmed, because sometimes you can generate with the choreographer and they can use it in ways that you don't like. So it doesn't guarantee sort of this healthy space. But there was something attractive and agentic that they wanted to engage in. Rebecca, the choreographer at the time, she defined it slightly differently, a lot wordier and denser, because that is how she operates and is in the world. But she talked about that physical research for her is the translation from the directives or the words or the proposals out of the mouth of the person who's leading the space, from their mouth to the recipients in the space, and how the recipients translate that language through movement is the way that I define physical research. And so she highlights this idea of proposals, that there are something that a choreographer can say or propose or suggest, and that comes from the mouth of the person who's leading the space. She doesn't want to call him the choreographer, the teacher. It's just like leader. And that the recipients or the dancers, they receive it and translate that to movement. And there's sort of this conversation back and forth between words and movement. I then made it even wordier and more academic and said that it is a dialectic process of inquiry in which participants iteratively respond to proposals in order to create a solidifying substrate. Because to me, what really came out in looking at this data and talking to Rebecca is that there's this conversation between the choreographer at the bottom, that sort of trapezoid is the dance floor or the Marley, and you can sort of see it from their perspective, and what the dancer is doing. And from the choreographer to the dancer, they called those proposals a practice of sculpting. That's another emic term. And then what the dancers generated that the choreographer could see, they called that sort of the generation of a movement vocabulary. And so we can look at this as this process as the development of a substrate, as Chuck Goodwin might say, which would be the local or public configuration of action and semiotic resources available in interactions used to create shared meaning. So what is the substance or the resources that people are using to create shared meaning across differences, here verbal and physical. And what it does is it makes resources from the past relevant by transforming them in interactions that create a constrained but open-ended framework for subsequent actions. So the movements we're doing are in response to movements that have been done prior, but create new possibilities for future movements. And together we'll sort of settle on what those might be as we create shared meaning together. And so I want you to look at this episode again now from this sort of model of physical research.
Okay, so the first, I'm not sure what to call these, but the first one that I'd like us to improvise is warm water and red wine.
So boom, we have the first proposal.
So how can some of us create?
No, we're going to watch this version of the video. Sorry,
Okay,
I have
so
two
the
versions.
first, I'm not sure what to call these, but the first one that I'd like us to improvise is warm water and red wine.
Okay. Come on, where are we? Is this not? I have an edited version of this.
Okay, so the first,
Sorry, you're going to get sick of Rebecca saying this.
okay, so the first, I'm not sure what to call these, but the first one that I'd like us to improvise is warm water and red wine.
Okay, so that's the first proposal, warm water and red
So how
wine.
can some of us create warm water with our bodies and some of us create red wine?
Oh, there we go. It is edited. Okay, that's the initial proposal from the choreographer. And then the first proposal from a dancer comes really quickly. And subsequently, we have responses from dancers coming down to the floor. Another response that sort of changes the levels.
Yeah, and you're welcome to like talk to each other.
And now there's this proposal to sort of undulate or move. They keep sort of creating and exploring until...
Can my people who are warm water, the people that are lying down in Emma...
So now there's something that can be referenced. There's a movement vocabulary that's starting to generate.
This on diagonal with Emma being the most upstage right, and Hadassah being the most downstage left.
And Rebecca's new proposal is to sculpt. Can you do what you did, but change it a little bit? And the dancers move to a new spatial orientation, and that new movement affords new opportunities for movement exploration. So sort of it creates a constrained but open-ended possibilities of next subsequent actions. And they start to grab each other's feet and undulate. And so it happens pretty quickly. And so we get this first proposal, improvise warm water and red wine. That's pretty vague and specific at the same time. So it's sort of like now in the dancer's court. The ball is now in their court. And so what do? We have one dancer come down, a few come down after her, another one joins, but from a different level, and they start to generate a movement vocabulary. And we can look at that more in depth. The first dancer makes her first proposal, and if we start to trace gaze, we can see that almost all of the other dancers in the space observe this. They see her or they look at her moving down, but they don't all physically respond with their bodies. We see that two very quickly, who are sort of in close proximity to her, at least one is, make the choice to follow suit. And the way they follow suit is they sort of start to get on the ground like her. A third dancer then also decides to join this group as it happens in quick succession. We can start to see that a fourth dancer has responded, but at a different change in level. And if we look at the choices on the ground, we can see that sort of this linear pattern is starting to form. They're in similar body-like positions, lying on the ground on their side. Three of them are facing downstage or towards the audience, and one of them has a different shift in facing upstage. And so there's already starting to be some variation in how they respond in terms of proximity and positioning. And now we have this sort of level change. We can start to see almost like two parallel lines forming, and then there starts to be undulation within it. So there's like a lot of small choices that have big consequences as to what it is they can compose or create together. And this happens within just a few seconds. It happens pretty quickly. And so once that sort of solidifies or congeals, they have something that's referenceable and can become editable. And that's not to be taken for granted, because being able to reference or talk about something makes it changeable. And so then the choreographer is able to ask, can my people who are warm water, we didn't have warm water 10 seconds ago, now we do, make this on a diagonal. And so there's a proposal to do something similar, but in a new way. And that is to sculpt or iterate or refine or explore possibilities within this constrained domain. And so they start to wiggle on the ground and move to this diagonal. And now that they're in this diagonal space, there's now more moments for proposals and responses of sort of exploring, well, what does this allow us to afford? They don't just lie still. And so we can start to see that research continues even after sculpting. It's not a dead end. It's kind of a long and iterative process. You can see that now they're holding feet. We didn't have holding feet before. We still have three facing one way and one facing the other and one above, but now they're in a new position. They're touching each other. They're manipulating each other's bodies. And so this idea is now sort of finding new ways to manifest, and they're exploring this together. And so we can look at physical research as a case of ensemble inquiry and necessitates the group. We can also see that it kind of emphasizes dancer agency and movement choice. There's not being predetermined. How they choose to interact with each other is really consequential to what is possible. And so in terms of the ensemble-ness, we can see full body proposals and responses are made in relation to each other. A lot of work in embodiment is gesture-oriented, which is beautiful, but I think there's a lot more to the body than just between the shoulders and the fingertips. And so we're looking at full bodies here, and how these full body coordinated movements can make up both the means and ends of inquiry. It's both the process, how they're thinking about this together, and the product, what it is they find or create. which is kind of radical. That these dancers, in terms of their agency, they're choosing to respond and to those around them. We can see, right, that not even though everyone sort of was looking at her, not everyone chose to respond, right? We can see an initial proposal and the responses based on gaze and proximity. We can also see that those responses relate physically and spatially, but have variation amongst them. We can start to see this theme and variation, that I have a reference point, but I don't have to mimic or be the same. Actually, the changes and the variations is what makes the texture and this thing interesting choreographically. And we can also think about how the group is needed to know what the group can enact together. We can't know what we can do without each other. And that this starts from what the dancers know in their own bodies, and then it builds from how they sort of choose and notice amongst each other. And so if our first question is, how do people move through uncertainty together? The answer could be through cycles of proposals and responses that coordinate and recognize full body movement. And that can push our theories of embodiment to include full bodies and full bodily experiences. It can help us think about ensemble practices used for learning. So what is it that groups can express together? How can individuals contribute in a way that's meaningful to the context of a whole group? It can also sort of foreground this idea of simultaneity of ideas. We saw multiple people moving and exploring at the same time, when most learning environments foreground vocal or oral forms of communication, like this space right now. I have been monologuing at you for like half an hour. It really means there's only space for one idea or one voice to be heard at a time. But when we take voices out of the picture and we focus on the bodies, multiple people can share and respond to ideas at once, which is actually really exciting for how a group can be engaging and thinking together. And there is this sense of respect or dignity for others' ideas, that these dancers talk about this idea of seeing and being seen, of what does it mean to be in a space where what I do is seen by others as respected in ways that they're going to put it in their own bodies in new ways. That's really like a sort of radical change and what it might be to be seen by other people in a space, and how you look at others as ways to contribute and build off in close proximity to them. And I think this also, in general, just foregrounds dancers' understanding of learning. A lot of time, artists and their understanding of how things happen and learning is not foregrounded in much of our literature. So now that we've sort of gotten a sense of how it is people can move through uncertainty together, we're going to return to these atomic sharks to look at, they said they did it, and I'm hoping to sort of show you that there are some similarities in what these kids and their friendly scientist partner did together. So we can think about this liquid architecture activity or this physical research dance science activity as a designed intergenerational ensemble embodied sense-making environment. And so we went from how do people move through uncertainty together to thinking about how can people learn with their full bodies together, and how can we leverage that to disrupt narrow ways of doing STEM. And so we can start to look even at some similarities between what the dancers in the studio did and what these kids did in their practice. There's a leader in the space. It actually, in both of these spaces, called choreographer. Zan here was one of our choreographer partners. She was leading the space, holding up the images for them to respond to. We see a clump of people or dancers or movers facing her. In the first case we looked at, they were all of similar age and professional dancers being paid to be there. In this case, we have 6 middle schoolers and 1 scientist. So they're not all the same. They didn't all know each other before coming into this space. These were kids from various schools who did not know each other. And this comes from the Choreography and Science project that I am a co-PI on. It's an Advancing Informal Science Learning NSF project, AZL. And I just have to talk about the brilliant, awesome collaborators who make this happen. We have our 3 learning scientists in purple, myself, Dion Champion, and Aditi Wah. We have our design and analysis team of Lara Appleby, Curtis Thomas, and Rebecca Steinberg. Lara is a scientist and learning scientist, and Curtis and Rebecca, you might have seen them in the previous clip. They were in the ethnographic study, and we are still friends, collaborators, and researchers, and now they work on the design work together. And then we have Alex and Zan, who were our local choreographers for the iteration we're going to look at, and Nora and Kevin, who were our partnering scientists. And so we brought people from lots of different disciplinary spaces together to think about how can we disrupt narrowed ways of doing STEM. And actually, in our analysis meeting yesterday, we were like, oh, we need someone who does music. We need to do musical transcriptions. We don't have all the disciplines we need. So we're still just scratching the surface, even though this is a big and interdisciplinary group. We've done 3 iterations now of a 2-week free dance science camp. We're going to look at iteration 2 from 2 summers ago, which had 20 middle schoolers, 2 scientists, and 2 choreographers. We video recorded from multiple camera angles. You'll see a few of them, camp activity, and our iterative design work. So you'll also see video recordings from our daily adult reflections after the camp of iteratively designing and how we came up with the activities. Because this was design-based research where you sort of go in with a plan and then it goes out the window once you see what kids are doing. And then we did various different activities that used dance to describe science and coding to describe science. And we're going to look at how dance could be used to sort of as a window into science topics in this activity. In this case, this particular activity was the last thing they did on the first week. It was a 4-day week. It was Thursday. It was the very last thing we did, where they responded to scientist figures in groups before discussing sort of what they were. And the idea was to build off of everyone's initial noticings about scientific objects by turning them into physical responses that can pose to dance. And actually, the real design problem we had that we used this activity for was we thought that the students needed a little more help choreographically. Like, we were actually using this activity as a choreographic activity and not necessarily as a science activity. But as you'll see in the next clip, when our choreographers proposed it, our partner scientists were like, yes, that's science. And we were like, okay, cool. And so that conversation went a little like this.
Can I? What if it was the opposite? So they get the image, and without knowing what it is, they have to respond.
I like it. I like
And
it.
then
I
you should tell like, this is what it is, and then I think we'll see connection with
Yeah, and we can even be like, oh, the thing you did is actually really helpful. Can you do that again while I explain it?
which then I think will also help them hopefully trust their instinct.
Yeah.
Like, I didn't know what this was, but I moved
Something
through
happened
it.
through my body.
The intuitive pattern and spatial
So
things.
that
So this idea of not knowing and uncertainty was baked into the design of this. Initially, someone had proposed, well, describe what these images are, and then they'll make dances about them. And then I was like, no. Uncertainty here can be good. Not knowing canonically can be really generative for how we think about this. And so there were a few things baked into this conversation that, one, there was an assumption that youth ideas would be generative, that they didn't need to know sort of canonical jargon or a canonical description of what these images represented in order to have good ideas about them. That doing this, that sort of being forced into maybe sort of an uncomfortable or an uncertain space would help develop a trust of their instincts, both physically, choreographically, and conceptually. And that experiencing it in the body would help. The scientist who goes, I like it, I like it, I like it, I like it. She goes, yeah. And then when I'm explaining it, I know I'm going to be able to say that what they did was similar and helpful. Like, there's this trust of that their ideas will be good and that moving through it will be generative. And so what exactly did they do? We're going to look at how they developed their idea for their fourth figure, which was this one, which I sort of laminated on top of their enactment. And this is what that process looked like.
Ooh. Somebody be the fish. Okay, I can look at the fish. Beautiful looking Jimmy. Yes, yes, Layla, keep going. Layla, yes. Layla, yes. Is there movement in this one? No. Wait, yes. It can be no for some and yes for others. Okay. Go back
Yeah, I'm feeling some turning happening too.
Go back to number 2. Yes, Layla, I love this reference. And go to number 3. Go.
Ooh, oh!
Layla, and then Layla's going to take that. Right.
That's cold.
Go back to
Okay, so that, like, in quick succession with some prompts from a choreographer, they developed this idea. And so I think we can use this sort of lens of physical research to see how it is they are moving through these ideas and developing them together. So the first proposal, instead of sentence of make warm water and red wine, it's just the lifting of an image, right? Which sort of, the assumption is represent this image or make this. But it's a visual thing and not a verbal thing. And so in response to that image of this fish-like thing with red and blue swirls coming out of its butt, the kids and the scientists do the following. We can see like this, we can see someone sort of hunkering down and moving. We can see people nearby starting to add on as they start to generate their first iteration of what this might be. There we go. And if we look quickly, the first proposal is this one girl. She bends over and she sort of puts her hand down quick. It's interesting in both examples, there's a moving down as the first proposal. But that does nicely distinguish from if we all start from standing. A moving down is a nice distinction that I'm doing something different or I'm moving into something. We can see that there are 3 people nearby who quickly join in, who move in closer to her and start to build off. We can maybe make some inferences that we see sort of the first as sort of the gray-like structure, and now we start to see these swirls coming from behind. That's sort of inference, which I have ideas about. And then this next response is this like big sort of negative space C type thing. So instead of how our bodies close together, we're sort of starting to elongate this trail, using sort of a higher space to bring out the trajectory. And then we get like what I think is the most exciting and coolest proposal from Layla to spin around. Which is really interesting because this image is of the 2 directions of the spins, of the waves that come after a fish's tail. And so she is like enacting this spinning. And so she's adding locomotor movement that travels and dynamism to this thing that they're making. And then she like sort of jumps into place to sort of end it with a rhythmic beat, and her hands go above her head. And so this is a very complicated thing. We can see similar structures. There's variations in height, there's variations in facing, there's proximity to each other as they start to develop this idea. And now that there's something that's referenceable, the choreographer or the leader can start to say things like, is there movement in this one? Which is a very different phrasing of a proposal for sculpting than what we saw before. In the dance studio, it was move to this new spatial location. It was not a question, it was a command. Here, in more of a pedagogical space, the prompt for sculpting is a question or an open opportunity. And you can hear that what happens when she asks, is there movement in this one? Might you consider movement? Some people, I thought there was some people say no. We hear no, wait, yes. We hear a bunch of no's. So we hear verbal responses to that prompt for sculpting. And we also see physical responses. And so some people move and some people don't. And so there's variations in how they can respond. So unlike in the dance studio where everyone was asked to respond or everyone was expected to respond to a prompt for sculpting, here we see choice coming out in different ways, and we can actually see it verbally and physically, which is cool. It's happening at the same time. And then we see this reiteration of sculpting again. It could be no for some and yes for others. And sort of a ratification of their choices as they're starting to generate something. And then a command, go back to number 3 and go back to number 2 and go to number 3. And so there is we need to work on the transition to get into this. Let's do it again. And so they go back into another cycle. And what's really cool is in the process of going back, we see Layla retrograding her movement, where she keeps the spin. So the transition, if we're sort of like rewinding a tape, you would see her spinning. And so she doesn't just walk to it, but this idea of spinning is now sort of taking command in how she's thinking about the transitions between these movements and its role, which is very cool. And now when she spins, it's even bigger. We can see her peers are making bigger movements now too, like the size of their movements are changing, what they're doing is changing. And so these proposals that they're making with their bodies are being responded to. And it's sort of, I just want to do like this gesture. It's exploding into exciting new possibilities. And so in this case, we can see, again, ensemble inquiry that necessitates a group, that emphasizes dancer agency. We can see full body proposals, how they're responded to each other. This sort of coordination of full bodies is both the means and ends of what they're making. These dancers are making choices. And their responses relate physically and spatially to each other in slightly different ways than professional dancers, right, who do this for a living, but they're doing, so you can see they're doing really complicated things that take into account a lot of the same kind of choices that professional dancers are making. And so when we bring artistic knowledge practices and scientific knowledge practices together, we can start to get at what we might say are sort of syncretic knowledge practices, or new things that sort of take some from one and the other to sort of afford new opportunities. And what Chris Gutierrez says is that, or part of what I say with her, is that bringing scientific and artistic knowledge together can support the reorganization of participation structures that can serve as a context for possibility, ingenuity, the development of new dispositions, and for the organization of new futures. And so in this space, knowing canonical jargon, or knowing in a sort of traditional sense of what these images were, was not only not needed for participation, but seen as a barrier to getting at this creative way of thinking about these things. And it afforded a space where multiple people, middle schoolers with scientists, could be sharing their ideas together, which is a real shift in participation structures for how scientific figures are made sense of. If you go back to sort of Eleanor Oakes' work on When I Come Down, I'm in the Domain State, like, she's looking at the rich gestural practices physicists are making in making sense of diagrams, but it's still one person talking and gesturing at the rest. And so the simultaneity is really wonderful. So if we come back to this reflection of, I had so much fun, I described the pictures, we didn't really know what they were, we can see that they really did know a lot, and that not knowing what is meant by not knowing is a very particular not knowing, and that's not always the kind of knowing we need or want in learning spaces. And so to sort of make my last point, the sort of coda to this talk, I want to share a little of what our scientists, I shared a little bit about what the youth reflected verbally, but I want to share a little bit about what our scientists said directly after doing this activity. After the kids went home, it was like, this is the last activity of the day, of the last day of the first week. Everyone was like rushing out, and then we had a few minutes to breathe. We had a rushed reflection with the kids, but we had a few minutes to breathe with our scientists. And I think they really speak to sort of the syncretic expansion of what's happening in this space. And I'll let Kevin talk a little bit about conceptually how this might change what happens in science, and then I'll let Nora share a little bit about participation structures.
It's just starting to come into place, but
Yeah.
I'm getting the appreciation that when groups of people or animals or fish or whatever come together, there are little groups within that. And you can't just treat everything equally. And I think I would almost guarantee every single scientist that works in my field is thinking of them kind of equally at first, and then seeing what's happening.
Yeah.
But maybe you should start out with thinking that there's like affinities that maybe we can't measure right off the bat now, and just maybe what that does to thinking about it.
So Kevin says a few things. Kevin studies how fish school. And so that's what he studies professionally. And so he's getting this appreciation that humans, like fish and other entities that sort of swarm or school or flock, have sort of subgroups, or what maybe an agent-based modeler might say is sort of like a mid-level. But he's getting that sense of like, you can't treat these entities homogenously or as automata or as all responding to they don't all have the same behavioral responses to the same stimuli, might be what he would say. And he's getting that from moving with kids. And he's saying that almost everyone in my field of like studying these sort of group animal dynamics thinks of all of the animals or the entities as the same and having the same responses. And you can study one animal to understand how all of them would respond. And he's like, I don't think that's the case. That baseline assumption is fundamental to our field and might be wrong and might be hurting our science. And we might need to start from a sense that there are affinities or other influences to animal and human sense making. And we can see that he doesn't directly say this, but this idea that there are sort of propensities or affinities of who responds to who when is felt or observed in this phenomenon of physical research, right? Proximity or comfortability around people is a reason that we might respond to someone. We might choose not to if we don't like them or we don't want to be near them, or she's on the ground. I hurt my hamstring. I'm not getting on the ground today. Like there are a bunch of reasons why we might choose how we respond or flock or group with people. And that was sort of a felt phenomenon in this thing that he now is thinking has real consequences for his entire field, which is like, whoa, so cool. And then Nora talks about sort of these participation structures are radically different from what she does in her lab.
And then the other thing I'm thinking about is, like, when I have new students, undergrads or grads join the lab, like, I show them a bunch of these images that we had, but they just, like, look at them alone or with me, and I'm like, yeah, you can see, blah, blah, blah. And, like, now I'm like, they don't see any of it, and, like, to have my own research students, like, what would it be like for them and for me to engage with the visualizations and the spatial things in a, like, how much would that be helpful in getting into it and then applying it and seeing it in different ways, and, like, the collective versus, like, the one voice giving all of the information in one direction, as we've talked about before. But, like, I've thought about it in the outreach context, and I haven't thought about it in, like, the research group context, that, like, the brand new person in the room, we need their insight as much as we need the most experienced person in the room's insight.
I'm ready.
Yeah. I love that. And so for her, it's not just what is the science we're doing together, but that is directly influenced by how it is we do science together. And so she makes some comments that the structure of this activity of showing images to novices is a common practice that she does. But normally they're alone or with her, and she tells them what to see. She even says, blah, blah, blah. I tell them, you can see, blah, blah, blah. Like, and she's starting to realize that that's not what novices see. They don't see the same way. Right? We could look at work on professional vision or discipline perception to know that, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. That's a good thing, and that it's not being leveraged in her space. And so she experienced that and saw that with doing this with the kids, that kids were seeing things she wasn't necessarily attending to, and it was interesting and generative. And so now she's starting to think, what would this mean in her own lab? If instead of sort of the traditional structure of the most experienced person in the room or the most white and male person in the room talking at everyone else was shifted, and there were ways for multiple ideas to get out at the same time so that the newest person in the room or the more newcomers or the novices could have their ideas visible and think aboutable by the group, to her was really exciting that this could be done in sort of a collective way and not just a didactic way. And she shares that this sort of equitable participation structure is a consideration she's had when doing outreach, right? A lot of scientists, when they write NSF, like pure science NSF grants, their broader impacts are like, I'll go talk at a bar to adults about what this is, or I'll go to an elementary school classroom and tell kids what science is. Like, that's what they think about outreach and education. And so in that context, when it's not in her normal lab, she thinks about equity. But in her lab, she's like, oh, this is like learning's happening in my lab too, not just in classrooms. It's like, yes, we know this. We are learning scientists. But it was really like eye-opening for her that these practices could be generative in science-making spaces, not just science-telling spaces. And so we can see that these felt experiences of engaging in physical research can support both new scientific ideas for old comers and new timers, that this can affect both the conceptual terrain and whose ideas are needed for scientific development and what kind of participation structures might we set up to make that happen. And I think there's implications for learning in various contexts, not just in this informal camp environment, but also classrooms and labs where we can sort of disrupt prior knowledge or certainty requirements for participation. And so we've sort of looked at how these things come together, physical research as an embodied ensemble sense-making practice that requires unknowing or uncertainty, and how that can also, how this idea of uncertainty and leveraging embodied sense-making can disrupt neuroscientific concepts and practices. We might say this requires a low threshold for entry, although I'd like to trouble that, because I think the vulnerability of being seen physically in this way is actually a big threshold when most of our learning environments are built from a cognitive behaviorist model. So low and high at the same time, but it allows for participants to ground their sense making in something physical that's seeable and think aboutable for the whole group at once. You can observe others' movement proposals and then choose how to respond. You don't always have to be generating. You can be building off of what's being generated in front of you. Ideas develop and grow as a group, not just the focus and emphasis on the individual. And there's this expansive conceptual terrain grounded in what newcomers might notice, which is really exciting. And so moving through uncertainty fundamentally, I think, can change uncertainty in STEM in positive ways that upends power hierarchies in ways that allow learning from all I always get weird about, but let's hope. And I've looked at this work in a bunch of different contexts, thinking about foregrounding, relationality and aesthetics in choreography and mathematical sense making, looking at relating rules for improvisational choreography to rules for agent-based modeling, and bringing in choreographic forms of analysis to think about computation and choreography, and then also exploring what it means for bodies to be represented sort of computationally or by sort of different forms of technology, from computational modeling softwares to sort of TikTok filters on your phone. And that's it. I'm done. I talked for a really long time. Thank you for staying with me.
I'll invite you to further appreciation in whatever position. Thank you. We're at time. If people need to leave, please take food. But if you can stay, we can have a question or two.
Oh, we only had an hour total? Oh, I'm so sorry. I talked way too long. Yes.
So I can't help but think, like, a huge misconception I see in my teaching is that students think about numbers as sort of static states and objects.
Yeah.
But they're really actions, transformations.
Yeah.
So in this, I can't help but notice that you're presenting a static image of something that represents a dynamic behavior, and then they're arriving at static poses that reflect the static nature of the image and not the dynamic nature of the concept. So that choice of using a static image as your inspiration, I wonder, does that now change the way that they're conceptualizing these things rather than as dynamic processes, but as take a snapshot, here's a pose, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. So the choreographers we worked with, this activity comes from a practice they have called liquid architecture, and they do use static images, sometimes abstract drawings. What they like about this is it can sort of push people to look at a static image in multiple ways. Is it the blueprint on the floor? Is it three-dimensional? Are we doing what it feels like? Which part of it? Like, it's looking at reading and images and sort of blowing it up in 3 dimensions or adding some movements. I would say they weren't just static. I do think there was a lot of dynamism in what they were doing. I'll also say that as this was an iterative design-based research activity, we ran out of time doing this activity as fully as we wanted to in our first iteration. But in our second iteration, we did get to sort of more live out what had been proposed, which was the kids would generate images and then the scientists would share their perspective. And what we did was the kids generated their physical responses, and they were a little more static. You're right. And then we went one by one, and the scientists would describe an image. And after one image was described, they would go back to their groups and they would revise their choreography. And what we noticed very quickly is that the revisions of their choreography became much more dynamic and movement-based. And what I think was cool about that is that the scientist, as sort of epistemic authority, did not stop their exploration, but ended up fueling more exploration. So it wasn't like, oh, we did it wrong, like we represented it wrong, our choreography was bad. It was, oh, we could also do this, and what question did it raise? And so that sort of shift from static to dynamic actually became sort of generative fuel for their inquiry, which was really cool. Oh, but I'll also say what I think is special about this, and in terms of thinking about mathematics, because I have done some work in math, is in all of this is, I think what this does is it makes the object or the phenomenon something that must be enacted and made together. So like you're changing the ontology of your scientific model or of your rectangle or square. Instead of square being a noun that exists on a page, we have a giant Mylar sheet that we have to manipulate to be square. Square is now a verb. Square is now something we have to be and make happen, and we can't take it for granted. So changing the scale and modality of scientific and mathematical objects really changes how we can relate to them and think about them. So if my science model is a static representation on the page. That's different than we have to be it together. Sorry.
No, thank you. Yeah, this is wonderful. So I'm in counseling,
Nice.
counselor education and supervision, and so and I identify as an existentialist, and so as a whole, like this is just fascinating for me, and I'm just curious. I have a few things I can have a whole dialogue with you.
Yeah.
But a few things come to mind of like, for one, have you explored a little bit into humanist and existential theory and thinking about this? Because some people that come to mind is like, Merleau-Ponty's work and embodiment, thinking about Gestalt therapy and the ways in which that's like translated now into dance movement therapy and embodiment of experience. And so I'm just curious if you've explored that, and then two, if you have any feedback for this as a pedagogy, because again, as myself, identify as a dancer as well, but I'm not trained formally. I'm a hip hop and break dancer, but
That sounds strange.
in trying to have a pedagogy that really encompasses this, because with counseling students, this is something that this is the goal, is really to help them lead through uncertainty, because the whole substrate is the relationship between the client and the therapist, and you don't know when you get into it. You have skills, you have techniques, but getting our students out of their heads and into their bodies is very difficult. And so as an instructor, when I'm in front of the room, sometimes I try to lead them into embodiment practices, even just getting up and moving to music. And they're very reluctant as graduate students. That vulnerability, that's why I was shaking my head at the end slide when you're talking about there being a low bar. Because my students are very, they will resist. I think out of the 14 this semester, I had 2 that participated in just moving their bodies to music for 5 minutes to begin the class. And they were very adamant about what about it they didn't like. And so I'm just curious. So my first question is, have you explored thinking about some of the psychological theories and backing for theater of the oppressed, Gestalt, Merleau-Ponty's work, to help kind of anchor further your work? And two, what feedback do you have for this as a pedagogy and ways in which to help with lowering that bar a little bit and inviting students into that space?
Yeah. So my first is, I am not a psychologist. So your perspective is really wonderful. I know I've read into some theater of the oppressed work and some of Merleau-Ponty's work and some of the sort of ideas about intercorporeality that have come out of his work, which I think is really interesting. Sort of what is the physical or embodied sense of withness that can develop in moving with others? When does it feel like we are now a with and not a group of eyes, is really interesting. And so I do think about sort of how can we look for evidence of what Han and Jordan would say is intercorporeal trust, of how are we starting to anticipate or trust each other in moving together. So that's one thing, which I think is really interesting and sort of a hallmark of the sort of ensemble work. But in this question of sort of the psychological or the therapeutic aspects of this, that's not my area of expertise, but in interviewing our students in these programs, we do get a lot of feedback of I felt like my ideas were valued. That is an important outcome for us, not just that they can regurgitate a scientific fact, but that they felt we designed the space so that kids were learning from scientists and scientists were learning from kids, and that it was sort of reciprocal in that way. And we do think we have evidence that kids felt like their ideas were valued. We have an ISLS paper about sort of this idea of half-baked or timid ideas and what a space like this allows for quiet forms of affect. It's not just always the biggest mover in the room that can be picked up on, but what sort of more quiet forms of affect can be picked up on. And when you're working in this sort of physical space where a small idea is amplified by people's physical responses to it, you can start to see how more timid forms of participation can really influence and take shape in new ways. We had a student in our first iteration of the camp, one of our scientists studied the biomechanics of walking, and all she said was, it kind of reminds me of like a puppet, and then said Pinocchio. And then from there, we started talking about marionettes, and then we watched a YouTube video of a marionette, and then the choreographers were like, we know these marionette duets, and this idea of puppet and marionette and connections between the brain and the muscles, and what the strings represent, just took off. We built a marionette the next day, and then we improvised with the marionette as a dancer in our group. It just snowballed into this really beautiful thing. And she has this lovely interview of talking about how she normally feels like she censors what she says, and she has a filter. And normally ideas don't make it out of the filter, but that one did. And so we have these questions of what does this environment afford? And then pedagogically, real quick, I brought up this figure because we're starting to sort of analyze our choreographers' pedagogy. And so this is an account of, it took the Atomic Sharks 15 minutes to make their piece. And this is how much time they spent. So this is like time, how much time they spent in each image. And you can see there's a lot of like accumulating, going back, back and forth, back and forth. We sort of accumulate along the way. And the choreographer, Zan, who was leading the space, almost every time they went back to image 1 or image 2, like she prompted them to do that. So just that alone, if we look at the beginning of each one of these rectangles as a prompt by her, she was giving them prompts and directives on average every 15 seconds. And she was telling them more than just go back to image 1 or image 2. So almost a higher frequency than every 15 seconds, she was giving them a directive. A very basic reading of that is that this is a didactic and constrained learning environment that is determined by the person in the front of the room. This is bad pedagogy. She's telling them what to do every few seconds. That's horrible. But I don't think that's the sense you got in watching what they were doing. And so I think there's this sense of, you asked this question of how do you get people to get into their bodies and out of their, I think because we are fighting such a hard gravitational pull of being sedentary in learning spaces, it takes a lot of work and effort and structure pedagogically to get people moving. And so this sort of rhythm of prompting of try this, try that. Did you consider that? I see that. I like that. Do that. Like there's something to that I think really speaks to what Srinva Sohi and her colleagues have pushed us in the field to think about, thinking beyond the binary of teacher-centered versus child-centered pedagogy, and that instructor-led or child-led are the only two ways we can think. And I think this is a really great example that is sort of neither, that is sort of agentic and student-centered, but is also very structured from a pedagogue perspective. And now we've started looking at Zan's husband, who was leading the other group in the other space, and he is very different. Like these guys are moving the whole time. His group, actually, I have the side-by-sides. I can pull them up. But anyway, they did like one. They like talked about it and then did one. And then they did two. And then it just looks very different. And so we're trying to look at, they had very different pedagogical stances towards this. And yet what they did was very similar in some ways. And so there's, I think, a lot of variability. And so we're trying to distill what is the pedagogy of this and what are the different, what's sort of the depth and breadth of what's possible in this space. Yeah, Chris.
Thank you, Lauren. It's really an honor to get to learn from you today. So a couple places I'm starting, this is fascinating. I'm starting from I share Finn's conviction that like a lot of STEM concepts, like you're talking about number, like are fundamentally dynamic and motion. And when you, like I have lived experience and endless anecdotal examples of people who work in STEM fields who respond to and thrive on that dynamism and motion, with embodiment, gesture, and beyond. And
to your question, like these are the two different ones. Like they look really different. Yeah. Sorry. Keep talking, Chris.
Do you want to pause for?
No. I just wanted to pull it up.
But I feel like if we're looking at sort of like expert practice, right? People like see and feel the vitality of the things they're working with, and they use their bodies to do it. But then I feel like there ought to be Here, I'm going to privilege for a second, like, because I think the sort of nexus, like production of these kinds of activities for their own sake is intrinsically valuable also. Yeah. But if we are asking about like these as pedagogies for learning STEM, not just for building interest in STEM, right? Like I thought the dance was fun. Now I'm going to take but actually like for learning STEM concepts, it feels like you ought to be able to distinguish between certain experiences that all of them were intrinsically great. Yeah. But some of them are sort of generative for understanding, like, I'm thinking of that like fish diagram. I think what I'm seeing is like vortices moving in different directions, and you can you get one spin, and then the fishtail can like push off of that in a sense, going the other direction. Like some of the experiences might lead young people to sort of like understand those specific concepts and be able to then play kind of within them or with them, or use those material resources to I don't know, play a more specific game or kind of get into that concept, and others might not get there. And I'm wondering if you have any hunches on how you would distinguish that, where that goes.
Yeah, that's a good question. Something you said at the beginning, I had a thought. What did you say at the beginning, Chris?
Just like the conviction that so many STEM concepts fundamentally.
Oh, yes. So, it was small on this slide, but I really love where'd it go? Natasha Myers has a piece. Did Keynote quit on me? No. Natasha Myers has this piece on studying dance your PhD people. And I had an image of it here. We can sort of zoom into this cartoon. It's not her cartoon, but she has this, it's this great, right? Like, very good, Michaels, you're a DNA molecule, now get back to work. And so what she documents in this paper is that scientists do a lot of embodied work in their sense making, right? Like Eleanor Oakes has looked at this, like there is a lot of embodied sense making in scientific work, but when scientists are asked to report on what did you do or what counted as like your knowledge, this is always like that is not taken seriously and you wouldn't share that. Like you would be laughed at, right? And so like what is actually helping you learn politically is not seen as helpful or generative. And so they're asked to sort of hide or diminish that. And so I think so like that's one interesting thing is that like we're fighting these politics of like what's the reality, what's communicated. So that I think is like interesting because we can say that there's like fertile ground for bringing these together because this is what's actually happening in science spaces. And then we need to be able to sort of prove or show that it's like science worthy, right? Which is like weird, or hard or complicated. And then in terms of this question of like what is sort of just fun and interest generating and what is sort of more like meaty or sort of more sustained or sticky, I'm not 100% like sure. Like I know our like learning goals are not always in these spaces that kids know the science because these experiences were 2 weeks long. Like I don't think that's necessarily like long enough. And like in the group that the Atomic Sharks were in, this was our second iteration of the camp. Our first iteration, we had like 9 kids come. I think 12 total, but like 9 come consistently. In the second summer, we had 20 kids. And we were like, how do we handle 20 kids? This is crazy. And like they came in like groups of 2 or 3. So it was like these 2 cousins, these 2 kids from school, these 3. And we also had this like really dramatic thing where there were these actually Layla was part of that. Her best friend, she had found out on the first day of camp, was moving to another state at the end of camp. And so she was not going to be in school together. She was not going to see her friend anymore. And so if we ever separated them, like they would cry. And so, which is like totally understandable. Like it was like a real trauma in their lives. And so at the end of camp, in our focus groups that we did, we heard kids say things like, I learned that I could work and have fun and learn with people who weren't just my friends. And like that for us was like, huge win. That's amazing. Like they went to a dance science camp and they learned that they could collaborate and have fun with other people. Or like one of the boys in the space, on the first day, he came with his cousin and she told him, he was like, I'm not getting up and dancing. Like, I'm not doing that. I didn't know this was dance. And she was like, yeah, and if you do, I'm going to make fun of you. And then he became one of like the biggest dancers who wanted to lead the warm up every day. And it was like, oh, whoa, just like opening up possibilities of what could be seen in the world or what could do. Or like, in our third iteration, we did this thing where we had 3 big sticky notes on tables. And one was like, what questions do you have about one was the vitrification of larvae, the other was particle physics, and the third was for scientists. And what questions do you have for scientists was the most written on piece of paper. And it was like, how much money do you make? Do you have friends? Who do you date? Like, it was like and some of them were like really personal, like, do you date? Was like, or how much money do you make? They were like, I don't know if I want to talk about this, but this idea that like scientists are humans who have lives outside of a lab, who have likes and dislikes, like that was a really big thing of like, what does it even mean to be a scientist? Who is a scientist? I'm talking to a scientist. They're listening to me. We're thinking like that was really big for them. And so like, I'm not sure, but we do, I think, see seeds of there are other important things that can be learned in these spaces that are valuable. And I think that the like hardcore like science concept learning is really important, and we do want to think about that because we do want to disrupt these systems, but these other things, I don't want to just privilege the like hardcore traditional science. So it's like it was 2 weeks, and in the case of our third iteration, 1 week. So I don't really know, but the grant that we're writing right now is to follow these scientists into their classrooms to help design, to do what that last scientist said of like, I want to do this in my lab, I want to do this in my classroom. Because once the school year starts, like it's back to business as usual. No one has time to like dream and imagine and like rework the wheel, right? And so they want to bring these things into undergraduate education. And so I'm hoping NSF will give us IUS money to do that. And so that would be sort of a more sustained look at older students who are already interested in science maybe, or have to take a required course, but we'd be able to follow them longer. Yeah.